this show. We're having
Oh, the discussion doesn't have to be an hour. It's all right.
we're talking about the presentation.
Oh, the presentation? Yeah, let's see what we can do. Yeah, let's see what we can do. Yeah, let's try and sure. It won't be 15 each. You'll be 15. Guido'll be 25. I'll be 20. Yes. Okay. That's all right. Okay. Yeah, 25 for him. Yeah. Okay. Um, 25 for him. 20 for me. 10 for him. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Tonight's symposium is occurring in association with the Palladio show at the Morgan, and we are delighted to have here tonight representatives from the Royal Institute of British Architects who have sponsored the show, the ones who hold all the riches of the Palladio drawings over here, the vault. And after I make a quick set of comments to introduce tonight's occasion, I'm going to have the director of the library come up and give us a short talk, a couple minutes description of their efforts over there, and also the chief curator. Tonight's occasion is an occasion for recombination. Manfredo Tafuri, in his book, Venice in the Renaissance, claims that Palladio is the master of the combinatory arts. He says, it is in fact undoubtedly the case that Palladian architecture displays an ars combinatoria elaborated within a true typological laboratory. Palladio won his syntactic freedom through a philological criticism that was in line with the best humanist traditions. For Palladio, however, the classical code was merely a, quote, field of variation and not a handbook of rules. That, I would say, would be the guiding quote for tonight. A field of variations, not a handbook of rules, for the way in which Palladio can speak to us today. In fact, I would say he speaks to us not just as someone who can combine various cultural and tectonic artifacts, but who can in fact recombine in a new recombinant forms that Palladio did, as we'll see tonight, and into some new forms of cultural mutation. And that's the legacy of Palladio that continues today. Our first speaker is Guido Box Remini, and Guido Box Remini is, in fact, the keeper of the deep flame for reawakening Palladio. He is the director of the Center for Palladio in Vicenza, and it is through him that architectural history and discourse and conferences and publications around the Renaissance and up into the 18th century, into the modern period, is being reawakened in Italy. A student of Tafuri, in fact, and trained in architecture and history. He believes in Palladio as a living force, not as a past frozen moment. Our second speaker was supposed to be Howard Burns. Howard Burns was described to me by Tafori himself in a lunch one time. He said the two pillars of Renaissance scholarship, Howard Burns and Christoph Frummel. Unfortunately, that pillar suffered some structural damage to his knee a couple days ago, and so cannot be here, and consequently my brief introductory remarks had to be extended into a presentation. I won't say I will stand in for that pillar. I won't even say I will take his place. Let's just say I'll occupy that time slot. And concluding will be Peter Eisenman, who is, I would have to say, the most significant force in architecture in the past 50 years. Through his architecture, his writing, his organizing, his provocations, his publications, his teaching, he has kept alive the field of and the discourse of architecture as a deep cultural and intellectual proposition manifest in physical form. It is never far away from physical form, and we'll see that in the beginning of his works to the present day. If we look at the classic image of Witkover, we see not only a series of combinations, and not only just a reapportioning and proportioning of the various villas as they manifest over time, but the possibility that this is, in fact, a performative recombination. These forms of recombinations were not only evident through the analysis of someone like Witkover, but as we can see in Palladio's own work, where a series of studies for the modernization of the Volpe house over here, or in his studies of the baths over here, all sorts of forms of taking spatial elements and recombining them into new imaginations of the past in order to push his own architecture in the future. We'll see from Guido Box Remini Palladio's illustrations for a series of tactical maneuvers. We just saw some spatial maneuvers of Palladio. We'll see his illustrations of tactical maneuvers in his illustrations of various war manuals. And if we go back to 1963 and a certain PhD treatise by Peter Eisenman, which was just published a couple of years ago, we'll see that Palladio appears. In fact, the building he's going to talk about tonight, Palazzo Caricati. What is interesting about what Peter says in his dissertation over here is that these are fixed spatial units, which he opposes to more dynamic movements, spatial units that he analyzes within his dissertation. In fact, I think we'll see today that he finds them much more dynamic than he thought of them at that time over here, and will show us a whole series of analysis. He does say in his afterwords to this treatise that after traveling, after 3 months traveling in Europe that first summer with Colin Rowe, I knew what I wanted to write, an analytic work that related what I had learned to see from Palladio to Turani, from Raphael to Guido Remini. In fact, Palladio precedes Turani for Eisenman, and even in his publication of the Turani work over here, we see already that the analysis of these dynamic movements are already being put into play. It's no coincidence that in that 1973 publication, there was also the second part of the Transparency, Literal and Phenomenal from Colin Rowe and Robert Slutsky, which began to look at the possibility of ambiguous repositionings on the facade surface, but already Eisenman was developing an inside-out, outside-in series of relations. Was in fact later on misreading the drawing so that an axonometric could generate a building. And over on the other side, over here, we have his final book on Turani, where Palladio leads the way. So Palladio has been one of the crucial figures, even perhaps more than Turani, and we're going to see that in a work in a book that he'll be publishing in the next couple of years of his Palladian studies. With that, I will now introduce Irina Murray, director of the library at the Royal Institute of British Architecture.
I'm not going to take much time. I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank Mark Rakatansky for organizing a symposium in connection with our exhibition, of which my colleague Charles Hind, the RIBA curator of drawings, and I are co-curators together with Guido Beltramini, one of the speakers tonight. I thought that since you have chosen a term originally pioneered by gymnetics, the term recombinant, in the title of tonight's discussion, that perhaps you might be interested in knowing that the most DNA of Palladio's that you are likely to find, you are going to find on the drawings that are kept by the Royal Institute of British Architects. I'm not going to tell the whole story, but it is a story that has elements of detective tale and elements of sort of great cultural shifts in the 17th and 18th century Europe. The drawings, we have the bulk of Palladio's drawings that survive. Some 380 drawings on some 330 sheets. It always makes me very guilty to say that, particularly in the presence of Guido, because Vicenza, so rich in the actual buildings, has ended up with a few more than 20 drawings. And so in order to study the drawings, you do need to come to London. And the drawings came to us through two great cultural figures, not just architectural figures, but cultural figures of the 17th and 18th century England. Inigo Jones, who went to Italy armed with a copy of Palladio's Quattro Libri in 1613 and 1614, and brought back some 150 Palladio drawings that mostly dealt with design issues. Some 100-odd years later, Richard Boyle, better known to you perhaps as Lord Burlington, brought back another stash of over 150 drawings, and eventually succeeded to purchase the Jones lot and the lot that traveled down through the successors to Jones's estate, bringing these 300-odd sheets together, pasting them into portfolios, giving them numbers and describing them. And that really is at the beginning, or really is a link in the vast exposure that these drawings had, at least amidst the architectural profession in England in the 17th and 18th century. And so when people ask the why of the prolific influence of Palladio on the development of Anglo-Palladianism in Britain, and in fact on the survival of his ideas, albeit in a modified form, for some 400 years, that story really goes to the fact that both Jones, his successors, and Burlington and his circle exposed the drawings to the eyes of others, mostly architects, but other people from their circles, and thus carried the influence in an almost uninterrupted form forward. Only 31 of the drawings that we own are here for the exhibition at the Morgan, which looks at a very narrow element of narrow but rich element of Palladian legacy, and that is the transmission of his ideas through Anglo-Palladianism to America. And that is the subject of the exhibition. The exhibition is accompanied by a number of educational events on different aspects of the exhibition, and I hope that it will not be disloyal to, not be seen as disloyal to this great institution if I mention that on the 8th of May, the Harvard Graduate School of Design, in cooperation with the Morgan and at the Morgan, is organizing a full-day symposium called Palladio Oggi on the relationship between Palladian ideas and contemporary practice. I would just like to hand over the microphone for 2 minutes to Charles Hine, the H.J. Hines Curator of Drawings from the RIBA, who will mention some of the salient points of the exhibition, and I wanted to wish you a very good evening. Thank you.
I shall be very brief. The exhibition is arranged really so that you can look at the architect's mind, to see how he looked to antiquity, to the buildings of Rome, to see what they could teach him about Roman theory and design. Then it moves on to sections dealing with how he used the lessons he learned from antique buildings in the creation of drawings and then of buildings, villas and palaces, and the progress of his design for one of his great Venetian churches, the Redentore. And then the Palladio section concludes with a section around the 4 books of architecture, the book he published in 1570, which placed in context his views on architecture and building from the simple elements of the orders and doors, windows, and so on, and how you put them together to create buildings, which of course he used as examples, his own buildings, and then to his studies of Roman buildings, making them more accessible to the intelligent public at whom he was aiming the book. And it's through the book and in due course the presence of his drawings in English circles in the 17th and 18th century that brings Palladianism to a wider public, and through pattern books in particular gets published, gets circulated in America. And we have a total of, I think, 65 objects. The American section is dealt with principally through models. But anyway, it's on at the Morgan until the end of July, and I strongly recommend it to you. Thank you.
Before beginning, I would like to say that I am here in New York as a Kress Foundation Fellow at the Italian Academy at Columbia. And for this, I would like to thank its director, David Friedberg. And I would also like to thank Mark Rakatansky for giving me the opportunity to speak here tonight. One day, in all likelihood around 1574, Andrea Palladio, in the company of the Venetian cavalry general Valerio Chiericati, commanded a military exercise. We know this from the eyewitness account by the historian Francesco Patrizzi in his book Paralleli Militari, published in 1595. Quote from Patrizzi: "The Vicentine Andrea Palladio, an architect by profession, and Valerio Chiericati, who had never seen war in our day, but books by Aelian and Leo and Caesar, were able to amaze those present. They saw the first disembark the crew and soldiers from a galley in marvelously good order, and then the second had 500 infantrymen to all the alien military drills in great order and with ease, and I was one of the spectators. The military exercises thus involved the disembarkation of troops and their maneuvers on land. Francesco Patrizzi stresses that the maneuvers directed by Palladio and Chiericati did not reflect the contemporary practice of warfare, but were entirely inspired by the ancient treatises, such as Tactics by Aelian, the 2nd century AD Greek writer, Tactics by Leo the Wise, who had Byzantine emperor, and, of course, Julius Caesar commentaries on the Gallic Wars. In the 1570s, Palladio was probably one of the most busy architects in Italy. So why, at the height of his career, did he devote his energies to military maneuvers on the battlefield, inspired by the great scholars of warfare in the ancient world? And how was his interest in military matters related to his activities as an architect? I will try to provide some answers to those questions in this lecture. But as an easy route into a world now very remote from us, I would like to begin by looking at these scenes from Spartacus, one of the Stanley Kubrick's great films. Following a revolt which has set alight the south of Italy, the turning point in the fate of the slave army led by Spartacus has come, an open battle in the field against Crassus's legions. Kubrick's first lingers over the slaves' faces, showing us how brave and determined they are. However, as the scene progresses and the organized ranks of the legion come down the hills, it becomes painfully obvious that there is an enormous gap between the generous bravery of the horde of slaves and the lethal, well-organized Roman army. Having come down the hills, the legions prepares for battle, transforming a chessboard formation into a combat line. Our hearts are with the brave band of slaves, but our minds are inevitably intrigued by the fascinating logic of the legion's movements. I wanted to show you these scenes because, surprising as it may seem, it was precisely this awe-inspiring logic and efficiency that Palladio wanted to reintroduce in the 16th century Veneto through the example of Caesar, Scipion, and Hannibal. Our story of Palladio's interests in military affairs begin with something he jotted down in the margin of one of his architectural drawings. I am talking about this small rhombus constructed by Greek lambdas sketched in the margin of the drawing of the Colosseums for the 1540s. Here, Palladio was not practicing writing the Greek alphabet, but he was jotting down a diagram taken from one of the books that he had been studying at the time. That book was Aelian's Tactics, one of the key sources of the 16th century thinking about warfare. Aelian has preserved the memory of the formation and strategies of Alexander the Great's successors, and, like in 20th century futurist book, the written text was illustrated with battalions made up of letters of the alphabet, symbolizing the various types of soldiers on the battlefield. In the printed edition of Aelian, horsemen are always represented by the Greek letter lambda, and in his quick sketch, Palladio is probably reflecting on the rhombus formation of a squadron of horsemen, which may be ordered in horizontal, vertical, or oblique lines. Palladio would have had no difficulty in finding a copy of Aelian, which had been available in various printed Latin translations since the 15th century. We also know that in the library of St. Mark in Venice, there was a 14th century manuscript exemplar. This was a Byzantine codex of Aelian, which Cardinal Bessarione had saved from the ruins after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, and eventually took to Venice in 1468. There are several reasons for believing Palladio may have seen and studied this manuscript firsthand. But there are also other clues to Palladio's interest in military affairs. In 2008, I was able to publish these two autograph Palladio drawings, which are actually the recto and verso of the same sheet, now in Worcester College, Oxford. In this part of the sheet, Palladio annotates a passage from Polybius describing the Roman legion, but the drawing on this sheet do not illustrate the passage of Polybius. They show two battalions facing each other. We see from the dash on the letter O, symbolizing a spear, that the two battalions are confronting each other, and one battalion assumes a specific shape in order to thwart the enemy army's offensive. This battalion, for example, is in a scissors shape to oppose the attack by this battalion. This is the scissor shape, and this in the wedge shape. These elements tell us that Palladio had studied a book of military tactics like this one by Battista della Vallo, which show exactly the same kind of clash between a battalion of scissors formation and a battalion of a wedge formation. 1, 2. Palladio was utterly fascinated by these books of battles tactics. Look, for example, at this is another diagram of this shape, and this is Palladio study. Look at the diagram from another book, Giovanni Matteo Cicogna, Military Treatise, published in 1577 in Venice, with this fantastic battalion of infantrymen deployed in a diamond shape, or this infantrymen in a triangle formation, or the 900 men in a rose with half moon formation, Battaglia a Rosa Lunata. At this point, we are hardly surprised to find affinities between the diagram of military treaties and architectural drawings by Palladio, like these two for the Temple of Palestrina. Similarly, we discover that this kind of treatise inspired Palladio, for example, for some project of villas like Villa Badoera at Fratapolesine, or in this, one of his unusual Villa Mocenigo alla Brenta, which has two curvilinear barns here and here on both fronts of the house, which is clearly derived from the treatise published 40 years before by Della Valle, with this formation with 300 pikes and 2 lunettes. You can see Palladio derived his project exactly from this. There is an element in Palladio's studies which I would like to stress and which Kubrick's film conveys very clearly. These drawings are studies of movements, are dynamic compositions. At this point, we have to go back to one of the seminal books of the Renaissance warfare, The Art of War, which Niccolò Machiavelli published in Florence in 1521. This was the only book whose publication Machiavelli had been able to oversee personally in his lifetime. Why is this fact important? Because it tells us that Machiavelli himself inserted the 70 figures presented in the text. In the conception of his illustrated text on war, Machiavelli was clearly inspired by the printed version of Alien. By the new features in Machiavelli's work was that the movement of the troops was represented. This is the first figure, figura prima, in Machiavelli's book, and is actually two images. This is the column of marching soldiers, and these are the same column deployed ready for battle. The column of X are the corporals at the head of the group of 10 soldiers. The O's with dashes are pikemen who bear the brunt of the cavalry charge, and behind them, each simple small circle stands for infantrymen with swords and shields who move into action after the enemy cavalry has been halted and the combat between foot soldiers begins. The change from marching formation to the battle array from the marching formation to the battle array, the segment of the column each move to the right of the next one. The pikemen thus end up at the front with the swords and the shields immediately behind them, and the corporals to the left or to the right of their groups of 10 soldiers. The second figure, on the other hand, illustrates how to deploy a marching column if an attack is feared from the left. In this case, the first segment of the column is entirely made by pikemen, and the corporals are at the head and the rear of every segment, so that when they move to the right of each other, the pikemen will remain on the right-hand side, ready to fend off a cavalry charge from that quarter. If the cavalry attacks from the right, the column is arranged in the same way, except that the various segments move to the left of each other. In the third figure, the movement becomes more elaborate because the segments of the column are of different length. The two central segments, 16 rows each, move to the right of the longer first segment, consisting of 25 rows, and in turn are flanked on the right by the fourth segment, also 25 rows, to create a space at the front to be occupied by the artillery, or, if the first 8 rows move forward, to leave a space for the main square used by the chariots. Note how the flanks are occupied by the pikemen to protect from cavalry attacks. I have always associated this dynamic representation of battle with this drawing in which Palladio is working on a plan for a palazzo in Vicenza. The palace was never actually built, but we have identified the site. At the bottom of the drawing here, Palladio sets out the measurements of the lot. As we can see, it is a rather special site, since only the right-hand side here adjoins a neighboring house, whereas the other 3 sides, this, and this, are freestanding. we know this because there are windows in the wall. You can see here windows in this side, in this side, in this side, and fireplace here. So only this wall is. By shuffling the individual elements, Palladio drew 20 alternatives. This is the site of the building, this is the building. And by shuffling the individual elements, Palladio drew 20 alternative ideas. Here he say, okay, corridor, loggia, and quarter. No, corridor, rectangular atrium. No, corridor, square atrium, scale, oval scale, square scale, and so on. Palladio's studies of the Roman army, as described by Polybius, produce another very interesting image. It is the first printed image that Palladio ever prepared. The image in question is the encampment of the Byzantine general Belisarius, inserted as unique illustration in the long poem Italia liberata dai Goti, Italy freed from the Goths, by Gian Giorgio Trissino, Palladio's mentor, published in 1546. Palladio's reconstruction of the Roman encampment closely followed the description of the Roman castrum provided by Polybius in Book 6 of the Historiae. As you know, a distinctive feature of the Roman military encampment was the fact that it was systematically constructed in the same way, independently of the lay of the land chosen for the site. Polybius mentions that the Carthaginians, on the opposite, chose naturally protected position, such as a hilltop or a bend in a river, and then proceeded to fortify them. The Carthaginians thus adapted the form of the encampment to the nature of the chosen site. But the Romans always built the same camp, the same structure, regardless of the land. The various military constructions units worked according to standardized procedures, very difficult for an Italian, and a previously established routine, almost with their eyes shut. They laid out a grid on which to arrange the various tents. This is the tent of the general, the width of the streets and internal path, the excavation of ditches, the size of open areas, and so on. As described by Polybius and reconstructed by Palladio, the Roman encampment was a structure built in the open field, fenced and crossed by a rectilinear axis. It has a well-defined hierarchy which culminated in a praetorium, the general quarters, surrounded by, this is the praetorium, surrounded by a series of minor quarters and open areas with specialized functions, the pay area, an area for horses, and so on. It does not take any great leap of the imagination to see that this structure is very close to Palladio's villas, which are organized around the owner residence, flanked by minor buildings dedicated to agricultural works and farmyards with various functions. The interpretation of the Roman castrum as a model for architecture is something that Sebastiano Sellio worked on at around the same time of Palladio, but he eventually transformed the castrum into a full-blown city. But I have always associated the Roman encampment with this Palladio drawing for the Rialto Bridge in Venice. It would be simplistic, however, to interpret them as mere bridge designs. It actually envisaged a rational organization of the Rialto area, the commercial center of the city. This is one of the very few surviving drawings by Palladio which addresses design on an urban scale. It shows the Rialto Bridge here, lying between two piazzas at the end of the bridge, with, on the right, indication of the main architectural features in the immediate vicinity, the Fondaco dei Tedeschi here, and the Church of San Bartolomeo here. Is Palladio considers superimposing the rational space of two rectangular spaces on the urban chaos of Rialto. In conclusion, we must not see Palladio's studies of the Roman army as being secondary to his architectural activities. Indeed, in the 50s-70s, they became a key part of his research preoccupations. In 1575, he published an illustrated edition of Julius Caesar commentaries, and on his death in 1580, the illustrated edition of Polybius's Historia was ready to printing. In 1575, the Venetian publisher Pietro de Franceschi printed a book entitled Commentaries by Caius Julius Caesar, blah blah blah, with copper figures of the encampment made by Andrea Palladio to facilitate the reader's understanding of history. Palladio personally applied for the privilegio, for the copyright for the edition in the last month of 1574. This fact implies he played an active role in the overall publishing project, and also he made a joint investment with the publisher. To an Italian translation published a decade earlier, Palladio added a study on the Roman army as an introduction and 42 etchings, which were inserted between the pages of the text. He took special care over linking up the words and images. On the upper left margin of each plate is one or more letters, here you can see, of the alphabet, also found at the incipit of the text beside the relevant passage. On the back of each etching, a legend lists the key places featured in the image and repeats the page number of the illustrated pages. Of the 42 plates, 5 provides a specific explanation. The Roman encampment, again, the Roman bridge over the Rhine, a section of a French-style walls woven with trunks and plugged with stones, a close-up view of the double trenches of a Caesar fortified camp at Alesia, and the deployment of the legion and the phalanx. The other 43 plates are all feature battles and sieges, at times with several plates in sequence. For instance, in these 3 plates for the 3 stages of the siege of Alesia. On the other cases, such as the plate on the Battle of Bibracte, 3 successive stages of the battle are set side by side in the same picture. The plate shows Caesar's legion, the Helvetii, the Tulingi, and the Boi. One is the first stage of the encounter, when the Helvetii horde attacks the 3 Roman legions, followed by the back up of the Tulingi and Boi. Then we can see the following stage, where the Helvetii have fallen back, pressed by the legions, while the Tulingi and the Boi, stage 3, are pushed back by the legions at another point. A short time prior to his death in 1580, Palladio was on the point of publishing an illustrated edition of the histories of Polybius, in particular of the Greek and Punic Wars. Palladio conceived of the illustrated Polybius as a continuation of the commentaries of 1575, a second volume of an ideal series. The 2 works share the same editorial logic, with an atlas of images inserted between the pages of the text, and the same effective number of plates and method of drawing and etching them. One interesting novelty is found on plate 2, which is dedicated to the Roman Quinque Reme. The Reconstruction, a unique document of Palladio's interest in the design of ships, follows Polybius' text, which carefully describes the corvus invented by the Romans to grapple Carthaginian ships in the First Punic War, and Palladio illustrates also this battle of the Cape Economus. The ensuing 39 illustrations are all stills from Polybius' narrative, with the effectiveness of an atlas. They represent the sequence of war events which led to the Roman conquest of the Mediterranean dominion. The theaters for the battle moved from Italy to Spain, Greece, and Asia Minor. Palladio's readers was thus able to see the reconstruction of cities that has been wiped out or greatly modified by time, like Thebes in Greece, New Carthage in Spain, or Seleucia Pera in Asia Minor. Palladio chose the bird's eye view for all the plates, which enables him to describe the landscape and also to create compelling images. The cities can be understood in terms of their layout and geographical context, while the description of individual buildings is only sketchy. Palladio examines sites with the eyes of a military man, taking into account the orography and the defensive or offensive potential of each site, rather than with the gaze of a traveler interested in architecture or natural beauty spots. Battles in the fields account for the majority of the images. The principal subjects are the deeds of Hannibal and Scipio. This plate is one of the two which are dedicated to the Battle of Cannae and shows the setup of Hannibal's and Scipio's army. The caption in the letter L and M state, weak soldiers in the middle, flanked by African veterans. In fact, Polybius recounts that Hannibal put the weaker troops in the central part of the formation so that under the pressure of the Roman legions, the Carthaginians fell back, attracting the Romans into a pocket, surrounded them and defeated them. This is a modern reconstruction of the outcome of the battle, and this is the other Palladio play from which you can readily understand the reliability of Palladio's reconstruction. The same goes for the Battle of Zama, where Scipio sets up the legions in small groups, distanced from each other in order to create corridors to allow the Carthaginians' elephants to pass. And this is the Palladio, and here you can see the corridor, and this the Hannibal elephants. But why was Palladio interested in warfare? You will have no doubt realized that Palladio's plates never show the clashing of massive armies and the heroic deeds of the commanders, who are never recognizable in the images. In this sense, Palladio's views are diametrically opposed to the painting of deeds, also when we consider the grandiose painting celebrating antiquity in Palladio time, such as this fantastical Topher Battle of Issus. Palladio's choice of a specific viewpoint provide the best way of seeing the deployments of troops in the field and the orography of the site, which is of crucial importance in winning battles. Palladio shows us the architecture of the battle, its geometry, almost its anatomy, we may say, alluding to the figures that Andrea Vasalio set in the landscape, the famous anatomy book. This Palladio's interest for army organization is only understandable if we link it to his parallel disinterest in military architecture. Unlike many Renaissance architects, from Francesco di Giorgio to Michelangelo, Palladio's interest in war was not focused on designing the perfect bastion or the most effective city walls, but primarily on the organization of the army in the battlefield. He writes as much in his introduction to the edition of Caesar's Commentaries. It is impossible, I am quoting from Palladio's text, it is impossible that any citadel or fortress can hold out and defend against the onrush and force of a powerful enemies. Thus, when I consider how to deceive these enemies and, more importantly, to defend kingdoms and cities, I feel that nothing is more suitable for the purpose than having an excellent and well-ordered army. For this reason, Palladio did not show any great interest in military architecture, but since in his early years spent in the company of Gian Giorgio Trissino, he had often studied the deployment of troops and military maneuvers. the illustrated edition of Julius Caesar's commentaries and Polybius' Histories, are the result of almost 40 years' interest in the subject. They were not intended to be academic exercises, but a concrete contribution to a practical debate involving intellectuals and men at arms in the Veneto aristocracy, bent on reforming the Venetian army on the basis of knowledge evinced from the study of the ancient Greek and Roman militia. Just as Palladio has turned in the practice of architecture to the example of ancient Rome as a model for constructing buildings in his own time, so too he made available his knowledge of the military orders of Caesar, Hannibal, and Scipio as a source from which to pursue contemporary practice. He did so, again as in his architecture, without neglecting the experience of his own age, whether the source was Machiavelli and de la Valle text, or the unfolding of the real military campaigns on which he was kept up to date by friends like Stefano Angarano. This is a very rare drawing of the Lisbon area during the siege of 1580, sent by Stefano Angarano, the son of Giacomo, Dedicatio de Quattro Libri, to Palladio in July 1580, in which is the deployments of troops. Defending the dominions and cities is what is most important. In his preface to the commentaries, Palladio thus reveals a civil commitment driving his interest in warfare. For Leon Battista Alberti, this is one of the architect's major duties. Palladio may have read Alberti's striking words on the subject in his preface to the De Re Edificatoria. I quote from Alberti. And Alberti said, "And if you were to examine the expedition that have been undertaken, you might well find that most victories were won more through the art and skills of the architects than through the conduct or fortune of the commanders, and that the enemy was more often overcome and conquered by the architect's wit without the commander's arm than by commander's arm without the architect's wit. And what is of great importance is that the architect conquers with a few men and without the loss of troops." I think that Palladio was interested in warfare also for another reason. He was born in 1580, in the midst of the wars of Padua, which had been lost and won back by the Venetians with a heavy blood toll for the Paduans in the tragic summer of 1509. Little Andrea must have experienced the war from below among the frightened, starving ordinary people. Hence, his first memories was probably linked with the years of fear, war and siege. In the following years, at the dinner table of Trissino and his humanistic soldiers, Palladio, Andrea di Pietro became Palladio, was to see war from another point of view. But a document I discovered in the Vicenza archive during the preparation for the Palladio exhibition in 2008 leave us little doubt regarding Palladio's opinion on war. It is a testimony during a court case offered by a friend of Palladio, the painter Giovanni Battista Maganza. It is a testimony of the vain attempt of Maganza and Palladio to dissuade their friend Marco Tiene from seeking glory on the battlefield. Maganza recalled, is finished. Fortunately, I can't understand exactly wrap up, but Maganza recalled, one evening, a few days before the said Lord Marco went to war, I was with Palladio in the house of the splendid Tiene, and in our conversation with Lord Marco, we came to the subject of his decision to go to the war. Palladio and I tried to persuade him as best we could that he should not go, reminding him that it was most dangerous. On account of this, Lord Marco became angry with us because he said he wished to go and he seemed to be offended by our attempts to dissuade him. Then Count Francesco, Marco Tiene's uncle and tutor, arrived and, on hearing our discussion, said to the Count Marco these words: "These men," meaning Palladio and myself, Count Marco, "are true friends, and they give you good advice." Advice which Marco Tiene did not act upon, and which cost him his life. He was taken out by an arquebusade during a real war, and not a war on paper, during the Mantua campaigns. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Guido. That was fantastic. In 1973, a young scholar by the name of Howard Burns published his first significant work with an illustration. It wasn't quite this one, but it was related to this one, the Temple of Assisi. A version of this you can see in the Morgan. And he made a kind of fantastic proposition, which is that what was important to Palladio here was the collapse in 2 dimensions of a 3-dimensional circumstance, and that would lead to that same kind of collapse to come to Palazzo Valmarana. In other words, and let's remember that this was 1973, the same year that Peter Eisenman published his first significant essay on Tiragni, and also Colin Rowe and Robert Slutsky published their text on the second part of Transparency. This was a kind of misreading on Palladio's part, that the Renaissance was not necessarily about truth, it was about representation, as every Renaissance historian has said to me, from Guido to Howard, and that it is this radical misreading of the drawing that creates a new kind of architecture. This kind of radical misreading of a drawing is the kind of thing that you would expect to happen sometime in the 70s or 80s by, I don't know, a kind of architect like Peter Eisenman. It's not, by the way, even though Palladio had visited Rome in many times, but particularly the last time in 1554, and seen the first 2 bays of Michelangelo's giant order at the Cappadocia. It's not at all like that. It's not merely residing on the surface of the palazzo. It actually digs in. It digs in so much that it breaks that middle entablature, cutting right into it in a way, and this is one of 4 abuses that Palladio does to structure in this building. He has a chapter 22, on abuses in the Quattro Libri, where he says, okay, after all, we're not really doing structure, but at least we have to represent something that looks like real structure in order not to frighten our viewers over here. But there are 4 times in this building where he actually breaks the structure, abuses the structure. Certainly one of them is the fact of breaking this entablature. Another one is cutting into the entablature on the top one over here, and then there's an oh snap moment, which you'll see a little bit later. If we, in fact, we take away the column, the giant order, and we see how we can now return the entablature, the mid-entablature, and leaving the 2 half pilasters. Or if we want to look at a drawing that Palladio did of a Roman theater in Verona and see a similar series of 3 layers over here with a single column, we can go ahead and put a single column in there, or we can take it out. But that's the way the building is. In other words, Howard Burns had suggested there was an outside in, that there was a way of bringing in an outside series of columns, pressing them into the surface. And now we're going to look at Palladio Inside Out. This drawing, to me, is the Rosetta Stone of this series of studies that I've been doing, thanks to Guido having said that Palazzo Valmarana and the Loggia di Capitiano were two buildings that were had never really, no one had ever really cracked the code of, and he had seen some of my digital analysis of Giulio Romano and thought that these might help crack the code. This drawing is a code breaker for me. It is a drawing that Palladio did where he took the inside, which is the courtyard view, and brought it flat to the outside, the facade view. Palladio uses his split screen effect many times in the Quattro Libro, sometimes in a complete drawing, as in this Villa Rotonda and the Temple of Peace. But he also, and this is quite different, in fact, from what I want to call the carving into the pumpkin views that you find in the Mellon Codex, in the Morgan, or in the Codex Connor, where you're carving in and you're supposed to see some kind of perspectival condition. Palladio isn't the first. I would like to say he was the first, but I actually prefer to say that it's Giulio Romano who's the first who does a full split screen where you have the elevation on one side and an orthogonal view of the interior on the other side. We know from Guido Box Remini and Howard Burns how crucial Giulio Romano was to Palladio, not only in the handing off of Palazzo Kenne, but also in the parametric flexing of the Ceruleana, or what I want to call an arcuated lintel, that happened not only in the Basilica, but as Guido Box Remini has pointed out, with reference to San Benedetto Po from Giulio Romano. And that's also true. You can see that in the inside over here, but even this back part and the back part of the Basilica where you have that arcuated lintel. But Palladio is the only one, at least until we rediscover the missing drawings of Giulio Romano, that actually used in a more systematic way this split screen. Throughout Quattro Libro, you have these facing pages which show the outside and the inside of his reconstructions. Let's be clear, this is a fantasy of Palladio's over here. He is not, he's drawing based on ruins and imagining in his own image what this might be like. If we go ahead and put that together, we can begin to see that what Palladio does is not in going outside in, but inside out. And he's breaking down the various layers of the building and drawing them all to one flat plane. And the animation of that looks like something like this. And now if we were to compare the elements in Palladio's reconstruction of the Temple of Nerva Trajan with some of the elements in Palazzo Valmarana, you see the giant order columns appear. You see the middle scale columns appear. The smaller scale. related also to the archway. The figures at the top. The top entablature. The middle entablature with this associated figure. And the bottom pedestal and continuous base. In other words, I would claim that these two drawings from Quattro Libro, that you have Palladio misreading his own reconstructions in order to imagine a new construction of what a palazzo would be. You can see this in the side view also, where you see those elements again, the large columns, the middle columns, the figures, the pedestals, and then the entablatures. And here you can see quite clearly that it's this strange misreading of just what is visible between those columns and how that entablature in the courtyard is split. Which relates to Vimarana. Similarly with the Temple of Antonius and Faustina, same sort of principles at work. And thus we come to this Rosetta Stone of his drawing here. And if we look to see at the courtyard, and we notice particularly these strange extensions of the entablature over here in the frieze area, these beam ends, and we see what that drawing, where that drawing was supposed to be. It might have been all the way back in the intended court that was never built. More likely, it was embedded and cut through here, facing that way. But that's collapsed to the surface. And now we can begin to see how inside comes out and starts to influence the outside. So you see the courtyard columns, middle scale columns, and the middle scale columns on the facade. The beam ends over here, and the trace of that on the end column. The 1.5 columns at the end, making the 1.5 columns over here, that 1.5 becoming the dimension of the courtyard column. And there you see strange beam ends and the projection of the entablature at the end where the giant order is removed. Another way to imagine this inside out is to look at an earlier, instead of the 1570 Quattro Libri, to look at his first drawings for the Vitruvius, the edition of Vitruvius that Barbaro produced. And what you have here is in the way in which the image starts to bleed through from the other side of the paper, you can begin to see what every architect with a roll of trace paper notices, which is that there are a coincidence of images that one then might misread and build upon. That's what's on the back side. The interior view of this Roman house reconstruction, again a figment of Palladio's imagination. And we now can see what would happen if we animate this and let the ink really bleed through. And you can begin to see how that bleed through begins to resemble Valmarana quite a bit over here. You have the doorway appearing between the giant order. You have the balustrade and the window. You have an archway. You have these middle scale columns here. This drawing, which looks like it was in the same series for Palladio, of bringing the outside court to the inside court to the outside of Palazzo Porto, is in fact not by Palladio. It is a later a combination by John and William Talman in the late 17th, early 18th century over here. They cut two drawings and put them together, perhaps because they had Indigo Jones drawings, perhaps in the spirit of the Valmarana drawing. But nevertheless, it points out to an important moment in the social history for Palladio over here of conceiving what a palazzo and a villa and what the recombination of antiquity in the present might mean for the social classes, as Palladio did his experiments in the reformation of villas and palazzos, his caricati, as Peter will show us later on, and all these mutations of these giant orders and porches and palazzo types recombining. Of course, the Palazzo over here of Bramante, Palazzo Caprini, with its clear division of a rusticated base and the noble floor, the piano nobile, various versions of that by Raphael with the assistance of Giulio Romano, and then Giulio Romano and Palazzo Maccarani starting to now blend, starting to create a much more hybrid condition between these surfaces. But here you have Palladio here now bringing the giant order all the way through this base condition. Here's that oh snap moment where what happened, I mean really it should be like this. What happened to the support, particularly at the end where you need the support the most in order to have a stable idea of what we imagine the Renaissance to be, but in reality that's what Palladio did. We could look for the ideas behind these modalities in some of Palladio's patrons, in Barbaro himself, and the issues of humanism and performativeness of rhetoric and other arts. We can look at Trissino and his recombination of even the alphabet, where he adds Greek letters to the Roman alphabet, to the Latin alphabet, or to his own recombination of Greek themes in the play, in the epic poem that Guido mentioned over here. That would be the second degree of separation, and it's a crucial work to be done, but not in today's lecture. But we can certainly now, with reference, super fast reference to Giulio's work, go right to the modalities of Palladio in this fantastic work that Guido has been doing, where what you have is these tactical maneuvers, and what I would claim is that Palladio is involved in tactical tectonic maneuvers, tactical spatial maneuvers, tactical social maneuvers of class and culture. In the final example, this is Palladio turns a corner. Palladio turns a corner inside out, really. You have this very strange like building, the Loggia de Capitiano. No one has ever really explained why you suddenly get this collapse of scale on the side over here. It's quite an odd building. But if we take the Valmarana drawing, and that was the revelation for me, that we could now unfold the two elevations. It would be like the Valmarana drawing. We can start to now compare the survey drawings of Valmarana and Loggia and now unfold them. It looks something like this. There is a precedent for this in Palladio himself, his drawing for the Ark of Gavi in Verona, right next to Scarpa's Castelvecchio, where he took the side elevation and pasted it onto the front elevation. In fact, at Valmarana, the very pedestal, this curving, strange, unusual curving pedestal is also at Valmarana. And we can even create the loggia out of taking the drawing and using the survey drawings to recreate that. And if we get it closer to the loggia, we'll add another column on the other side of the archway. And the very same comparison in Quattro Libro over here, where we see similar elements. We have the giant order columns, we have the middle scale columns, we have the inclining figures, and we have the entablatures going through. And similarly, with that second form, with the kind of trace conditions over here, a principle that Peter Eisenman has often talked about in his misreadings over here, we again have similar traces of these elements coming through in the loggia. And if this is not a tactical maneuver, I don't know what is, the way the door frame and the balustrade and the archway can line up to this strange drawing on the Bath of Agrippa, where Palladio illustrates what he'll do. The loggia. Quickly going through the corners and the edges for Palladio over here, which I'm going to skip through over here now. We'll notice that Palazzo Valmarana and the loggia end in this, this interesting ragged edge over here. But Palladio knew how to make an edge. In his sarcophagus and Arch of Traventine, he always made it an appropriate extension at the edge in order to be able to, for the capital to have a background. In the Rialto Bridge and the alternative entrance to the Bridge of Rialto that Guido showed us over here, you can see it over here 2 times the side to cover the capital. That's what the loggia would look like if Palladio did that. Ooh. That's what, in fact, it looks like. That's what it would look like if, in fact, Palladio had done that. But that's, in fact, this collapse along the edge. And we can begin to see now the way, and as he turns the corner, the way the base elements now start to recombinate and mutate. The base, the arches into an arcuated lentil, the single balconies into this mutant balcony, and so on up. The base, the arches. You can see that, that whole mutation along that corner piece. You can see when it comes around the corner how strange it is, the way it cuts in a brutal way. That capital over there, the way this Siluriana breaks through the entablature. Quite brutal. Here's that strange moment, the collapse of that side. Already in his arch of, already we're turning the corner for Palladio. Palladio is turning the corner of his work and starting to involve in his most complex late work of the churches. And in this detail in the San Maggiore drawing over here, San Giorgio Maggiore drawing over here, we can start to see the relation between these 2 elements. That looks like this in animation. Here are the 2 versions that you already see a mutation of. Now if we bring in the loggia, flip it. Clone the detail. you can start to witness the mutation. And thus, to conclude, we can see that now in the unfolded drawing, the whole mutation of different scale elements and niches and windows and giant orders and small orders start to happen between the loggia and the first church, San Francesco, which you see here, or in San Giorgio. And you start to see this strange way in which now the nervous energy of the Venetian environment, the Venetian wall surface, starts to become a whole mutant internal surface with this total train wreck of a series of columns and pilasters in the corner over here, this mutant corner. And in Redentore, where you have the similar form of mutation, you have, in fact, Palladio now coming from his travels to Rome just wrapping up here, travels from Rome, experiencing the mannerism of Bramante and Raphael and Giulio Romano, meeting that nervous service, but as individual elements, and now meeting that nervous surface treatment in Venice and recombining both of them into these nervous forms over here. And this model, which I will leave you with, if you squint at it enough to see this mutant form of colonnade in the church over here, it might look like some of the drawings you saw in the student publication abstract that you picked up last week over here, but you can certainly take a look at it in the Morgan where it resides now. Thank you. Peter Eisman.
I was told we were going to watch the Final Four tonight, and I don't know if we're going to get to do that. But all of you don't care much about basketball, so you wouldn't be here. But I do. So I'm going to be brief. Thank you. I'm going to talk about the Palazzo Chiericati. I'm going to show a few drawings. Basically, my thesis, I have made about 800 drawings of Palladio's buildings. As Mark would tell you, I tend to misread what I'm reading. So therefore, I'm not sure it's Palladio or me that I'm drawing. But it doesn't matter. It's a way of looking at the work. I want to suggest that I believe that all architecture is coded, and Mark raised that issue, that there are no agreed upon sign systems, that you can look at things as Guido did or Mark did in one way or another way. You can see battle formations, you can see mutations, you can see whatever you want to see. And I actually believe that's true. And how do I get the first slide? I mean, this thing does it? That does it? Okay. Is that the first one? That the first one? I don't think so.
There?
Yeah, okay.
There.
There you go. This is the corner of the Palazzo Ducali in Urbino, and the reason why I show it to you, I think, is an idea of a formal resolution to a corner where you can see the doubling of the columns, the flattening of the columns, and you clearly read corner. And I'm going to do the next one. This is Bramante's Santa Maria dell'Apache. And the solution at the corner is a very strange one. It's, first of all, a very strange courtyard because it's a four-opening courtyard, and there are very few with a column in the center, which is a no-no in all of the books of history that we know about. Basically, I would call this a virtual court in the sense that Bramante had a pre-existing scheme. It didn't fit into the site, and therefore you get the strange conditions of a corner where we have this rosette left over from columns. So that I think that they're very different. The courtyard in Urbino is a formal resolution, and the courtyard in the Santa Maria dell'Apache refers to something I would call as a virtual organization. That is, it speaks to something that isn't there, that can't be known from what is there, but speaks of another kind of organization. Here is Vitkover's view of Palladio. Of course, for me, I've always found a problem with this, that it takes away one of the most important elements of Palladian work, and that is the poche, the thickness of the walls, and how you can tell the difference between Palladio, Vignola, Scamozzi, and others through the application of the poche, how you can tell the difference between inside and outside through poche. But here, Vitkover reduces Palladio to a mere set of line drawings. Chiaricati is interesting to me because I assume that there is a virtual villa, not an ideal villa, but a virtual villa that exists in Palladian work, a virtual schemata, which starts from an A, B, C, B, A from front to back. That is, an A is a portico, a B is a transition space, a C is a maiden space, usually articulated by poche. A B is the rear circulation space, and A is the final portico. And here we have all of those elements in a virtual villa compressed into a series of layers. And you have to notice the portico here, where this double column tells you that, in fact, there is a compression of a portico element, which is the A element, into the transition space, or the B element. So you have A over B. You have the C, which is the main space, always articulated by poche, and we could go through hundreds of drawings that would show the state of this virtual villa. And then we have what is the most amazing thing is the compression of the rear portico into the B, or circulation space. So the A is compressed into the B to give you a garden back here. And what you get is, for me, one of the most fantastic of the villas, if you read it in terms of this virtual villa, of a compressed series of layers, unlike any of the other villas. There's Bertotti Scamozzi's rendition of the same project, and you can see just in the drawing how Palladio loses the sense of the poche and is reduced to a very limited palette of drawing. Palladio's own drawing of Chiaricati. And what I did was to try and describe through a series of axonometrics, which I won't bore you with, but a series of diagrams which try and elaborate this overlay so that the blue is always the C space, the pink and other colors are the A and B spaces, and the drawings attempt, each one of them, to show a different aspect of the compression of this virtual villa. That is, the elements are there. Their syntax, their formal syntax, is very different than they would be in the virtual ABCBA rendition, but they're all still there. A further compression of these, and you see the little arrows pointing to those compressions that sometimes work from the front and sometimes operate from the back. The ancillary spaces here and here in the blue of the C organization, and again a variation of that in terms of the poche. And then another reading of the blue or main space, again with this compression acting upon the diagram. These drawings were picked out of a sequence of about, I guess there are about 80 or 90 on the Palazzo Chiericati that I made to try and understand every bit of the poche and what exists in the actual building. And here we get the compression of the portico into the B, or what I call gasket space, the circulation space. And then the compression of this into the C, or central space, and an overlay then of the columns as they operate in these two spaces. And then flattening out into what would be a normal A, B, C, B, A, and you can see how there is the compression of the all of those elements into this flattened rendition of a virtual villa. There you can see very clearly the letters A, B, C, B, A, which would be the actual layers as they would appear. This layer is outboard of the portico that's compressed. This layer is behind the wall of the garden. And you see how this would be the layers of this virtual villa, and how they then become compressed as the A over B and A over B in the rear, and the C being the only space left, as it were, intact. And then again the C space being acted upon from both the front and rear, causing what would be normally a oval or more circular space to be a compressed lozenge shape, and one sees it in that particular C. This, I feel, for me, is a very useful exercise, because I can then take and read all of the Palladian villas with this same kind of diagnostic to show that they can be read in any number of ways, and to show, in fact, that there are a lot of issues in Palladio that have something to do with the space that we operate in today. I want to thank Mark for allowing me to show these images in the context of a very serious discussion. They are interesting and illuminating to me, but probably very little to do with the historiography of Palladio. And I also want to say that for 50 years, since the first time that I went to see the loggia, I found out that I had been spelling it and pronouncing it wrong. I was told it was the Loggia di Capitano, and now I find out it's the Loggia di Capitanato, and I'd never heard that before in my life. So for 50 years I've been under the misillusion that I was looking at something, and I now have to correct my own illusion. Thank you very much.
Gentlemen.
Maybe they have some questions.
Yeah, they come over here. What do you think these mics are up here for?
What? You think I'll get to watch the second half? You're a dreamer.
Do I have to do anything here? No. I have a couple of quick questions, but really I want to see if these gentlemen have questions for each other. Among the questions I want to ask, Peter, you didn't really spell out, let's say, why out of any of the villas you wanted to obsess about Caricati. It isn't a natural choice among his buildings. Why that palazzo? And I think it would be worthwhile, because clearly it's been obsessing you by the number of drawings you've been doing, why you think it has to do with practice today and what has to do with your practice today.
Well, first of all, if modernist space is to be seen as, well, if we start with as an assumption that I make as an architect, not as a scholar, that the difference between Greek and Roman space is that Greek space, going back to the time when they moved from wood to stone, demands being seen on the 45-degree angle, that you have to understand the Parthenon and neoclassical buildings are always drawn shingle from the corner, receding into a kind of space. And Roman space is thought to be frontal and in fact layered. And I would argue that the difference for me in modern architecture between Greek and Roman is between Mies and Le Corbusier. Mies is always meant to be seen on the corner, as is Philip Johnson's Glass House, and Corbu is meant to be seen like Garches and Poissy and Maison Cook and many others frontally. So that modern space for me, modernist space, is layered, flattened, cubist space, etc. And when you go in 1960 as a neophyte to see Palazzo Caricati, you say, "Oh my gosh, that's flattened modernist space." Very unlike Rotunda, which I find one of the least interesting of the villas, because it's it does have its own flattening and its own layering, but probably in a very much more subtle way. And so Caricati always struck me as really important, talking about the possibility of layered space in the 16th century. And of course, when I went with Rowe to see these things, Colin would say he'd go sit in a pub someplace and have a beer or whatever, and I was to sit in the sun and analyze what it was that I saw in each of the villas, that couldn't be seen. That was not there. And of course, the one that was the most difficult for me and remains the most difficult and problematic is Chiericati. And of course, trying to describe what isn't there is a continual preoccupation of mine in the drawings that I make. And the lesson of Rowe for me was always, and I remember spending many hours under the Venetian sun, seeing what wasn't there. And that's why I think Palladio is important. I think that's why Chiericati is important, and that's why I think it's important to considering space today.
One final question about that, and then I want to ask questions to both you gentlemen over here, and then open it up to the audience. Well, to see if you have questions first for each other, and then open it up. It seemed to me that, in spite of the fact that at various points Rose suggested that what would happen in literal, in phenomenological transparency, which that the incidents of what you couldn't see would find their way to the facade. In fact, most of the time, it was a collapse on the facade for him, and not this internal movement. You almost immediately, or at least by, well, even in your thesis, started to look at something that he wasn't looking at, which is that internal movement coming out and the outside movement coming in.
No, my thesis was written as an attempt to get out from under Rowe, as I've said on many occasions. I mean, the Rowe influence, having done it for 90 days and 90 nights for 2 summers without a break, I got it, all right? I got it as badly as anybody, and I needed to find a way out. And the thesis was actually an attempt to critique Rowe and critique Rowe's view of, especially of Corbu, Terragni, and Palladio, and by introducing, first of all, the whole idea of inside outside, and the second, probably even more importantly, the first introduction of the linguistic paradigm, let's say. And of course, Rowe couldn't stand anything that resembled linguistics or what he would consider science or pseudoscience. And so this was in writing this, was my attempt to rethink and reform what I had learned from Rowe.
Now, I'm going to get to my final general question for you two, but I'll throw it back to you, Peter, and then turn it to Guido, which is, but in the thesis, even though you illustrated Chiericati, you illustrated as, I can't remember the exact words, but these were stable units. When did you start seeing Chiericati as with those more dynamical conditions that you are now illustrating now? In other words, you didn't put it under the analysis, you put the other buildings in there.
No, but hard to reconstruct when I started to relook at a lot of these things that I talked about in the thesis. Don't forget, if you were to read what I wrote about the Terragni and you read about what's in my book, they're very different texts. If you read about what I wrote about Le Corbusier and what I've written subsequently, you would find it's very different. So you have to understand that 1963, a very naive American was writing some very naive stuff about things that were 3 and 4 years before Rossi, Venturi, Gregotti, or any of those people, Tafuri, had published anything. I was writing in the dark, basically, in a sense, in a dark age, writing about something that very few people had very much interest in. So I can be forgiven, I think, some alterations to what I thought in 60 to 63 and what I thought, let's say, starting in 73 when I started rethinking very clearly those projects.
Yeah. what I was struck with, Guido, in the frontispiece that you showed us for Caesar, the Caesar book, where after the blah, 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 and it said illustrated, illustrations by Palladio, and it's, and I can't remember your translation, but, you know, for the purpose, and I remember the words on the frontispiece, of the cognition of history, to help with the cognition of history. What do you think the role, how would you like to refer to the role of Palladio or architects as illustrators of history thinking out loud?
Yeah, is to facilitate the reader's understanding of history.
Right, but the word that's used is cognition. So, cognition, yeah.
Cognizione, yes,
Yeah.
della storia. Sì. In
So-
Italian, yes.
What's the, I mean, given readings and misreadings, constructions and reconstructions and misreconstructions that Palladio engaged in, and the play between the two, what would you say would be his role as someone who brings forth history as thinking, as cognition?
Yeah, I try to understand if Palladio saw to reconstruct the cities, for instance. I try to understand the sources of Palladio. If he uses maps or other things, and I understood that Palladio doesn't use anything. It only starts from the Polybius words, and as in the Vitruvius book, you have to start from the words of the book, and if you look at the buildings, the informations are different. In the same way, Palladio, like Borges' City of Papers, he designed space battles only on the basis of words, and this is his way of read history. And we must remember that also Caesar and Polybius are first-hand sources, because Caesar talking about his battles, and Polybius was a testimony, a witness of the battles. And Polybius said, I tried to see all the plays of all the battles of Hannibal, and I also spoke with person who was there when Hannibal came. So this is, I think.
Any questions for each other?
I wanted to clarify one thing in the drawings, because I didn't, in my desire to move on, was the drawings really speak to what I would call positional and relational notations rather than proportional or functional. In other words, they are merely reading away the formal conditions of proportion, ratio, function to use, etc. And what I wanted to show was that you can read Palladio in an entirely different way, that is, in its positional. And that's why I say it's not an ideal villa. It's a virtual positioning of an A space, a B space, C, B, A. And in every one of, and even in the churches, I can do it with Redentore and Santa Maria Maggiore. I can produce a positional and relational notation that begins to see these buildings in an entirely different way than reading their proportional or their functional use. And that was the intention, is to try and develop a typology of relations and positions rather than proportions.
And I want only to say that Palazzo Chiericati is really the most important building for Palladio, because it is the turning point of his career. Before Palazzo Chiericati, Palladio was another man, and Palazzo Chiericati is his new language, completely different from everything. So you obviously choose exactly, I think, the the navel of Palladio body, I think, because if you, with Palazzo Chiericati, Palladio became an architect completely.
And in fact, if we might assume that Peter, as opposing the proportioning, opposing Wittkover in the question of proportioning, not unlike his mentor Colin Rowe, who was in flight from Wittkover, even as he used him in the mathematics of the ideal villa. But in fact, if positioning would be otherwise seen as a kind of misreading, precisely what we saw from you, Guido, today is that positioning and repositioning is an obsession for Palladio. Questions from the audience?
I'll give a couple of comments and then a question. I think it's a tribute to Palladio's genius that he, with the training as a stonemason, not coming to architecture as a theoretician, but as a sculptor.
Is this working?
So learns to interpret words into a built form. So just as he takes Polybius and Caesar and recreates from words only battle formation, so he goes to Vitruvius, which has no illustrations, and recreates buildings from paper. Secondly, Mr. Eisenman, in saying he's entitled to reconsider what he wrote 40 years ago, again, Palladio in 1570 in the 4 books goes back to his early projects and redesigns them, sort of re-engineers them in the light of experience and his didactic purpose in producing the book. But just reverting to the Palazzo Chiericati, what fascinates me about the way you describe the ABCBA process is that Palazzo Chiericati mixes up spaces in a way that he doesn't anywhere else, because the portico, is a public space. It's the highly visible space, and it's the space that the humblest visitor would reach. The B in the villas is a private space, and yet in the Palazzo Chiericati, because of the situation of the palace overlooking a public square and the deal that Chiericati does with the city authorities to gain extra space for his villa, his palace, because it's on a very narrow strip, and he negotiated with the city council to get extra space, providing the ground floor was given over to public walkway, and he could build his rooms over the top. It gives a completely different effect. And I just wondered if you have any views on how Palladio saw his spaces being used.
Well, honestly, I'm not an anthropologist or a sociologist. I'm really totally unconcerned with how they were used. I'm interested in the formal, for example, the loggia. I've had explained to me the loggia that I call Capitano, which is not that. I don't even know how to pronounce that.
We can use both.
Huh?
Yeah,
We can use both.
it's both.
It's both?
Capitano is the person, Capitaniato is the charge.
Okay. Anyway, when you see that corner that I touched so reverently with my students last fall, it was explained to me why that side was at smaller scale, why the function in the civic functions had something to do with why the front, or what we call the front, was a larger scale and this was a smaller scale. I can't even remember what that is. All I can remember is that corner is something I say to my students, hey, see that? That's architecture, and take a look at it. I don't know how to explain it any better. I don't believe whether they could tell me what the function was would help them explain how to make that architecture, because there's something magical. That corner for me is one of the great corners in architecture, and I know there's a functional reason for it to be that way, but nevertheless the magic is still the most important thing. For historians, for scholars, they need to explain it in a different way. I need to teach my kids, who I teach, how to see that corner, not to know why it was that way.
I also don't know if it is a question or maybe a comment also in relationship to Chiericati, which I think, one of the first things that I would mention is that it's not included in Vicover's diagram, right? And that is to me a little bit of a key. The reason that it's not part of the ideal villas, right, may be a key to understand another kind of problem, which is something that maybe Vicover was looking for, an extreme sort of relationship across these villas that they were quite similar to each other, understanding a problem of variation, as maybe Mark put it in his presentation. And I wonder, something that is very interesting in Chiericati, that variation requires such a change, right? You still can read a 9-square grid in the Palazzo Chiericati, but it's extremely deformed, right? And that extreme deformation, what it does, to me at least, right, is that it criticizes the entire typological question that Vicover somehow trace across the entire other villas. So I think that in that sense puts together a certain interesting relationship between topology as a certain kind of relative deformation or gradual deformation against a rather more structural deformation or maybe a type. So I wonder, if in that sense the interesting on the layering, right, what it produces to the 9-square grid carries such a radical transformation of the type, and why that was included maybe in the Vicover's diagrams.
Guido, that's for you.
Difficult. I don't know.
But he doesn't include if they're villas. He doesn't include the palazzos.
Yeah, but still it's a 9-square organization, right? Which, in relationship to his ideal type, I think that one can argue that Chiericati is also part of that progression, right? That somehow acquires such a change, right? That still is related to a 9-square grid, right? But it somehow doesn't fit this idea of variation that we cover is sort of presented.
Would you say that that's 9 square?
Oh, it is, for sure.
And how would you say it had been reformulated?
Well, I tried to show in my drawings how it was reformulated, but,
yeah, but
I mean, you could argue that. It's hard to do without drawing it. I mean,
yeah.
it is a compression of a 9-square grid, as most of the villas are. Even though there are 5-part related. See, what's interesting is there are 5-part relationships from side to side and front to back, and yet which would give you 25 squares.
Yeah, see, that's what I mean. It's not.
Yeah.
It's not
Well,
really.
it is actually both.
Yeah.
9 and 25.
Yeah.
Which is a variation. It's not 4 and 16.
Right.
So
But also, it's interesting the typological type in there, and because Peter isn't exactly telling the truth when he says he's not really interested in use, because the very description of A, B, and C were all use descriptions. There were descriptions of private space. There were descriptions of what those space would normally be.
I was talking. No, I mean you have to say portico. I mean, I don't know.
No, but you were talking about the ceremonial space in the middle and.
Well, the main space.
Yeah, the main
Which is the poché space. I could say the poché space. The C space is always the poché space. Okay, the space with the articulate poché.
Yeah, which has a social use.
What?
Which has a social use.
The poché?
Yeah. No, the fact of it being the fact of it being
the fact
poché.
that it is poché.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the social use I'm not really interested in. I'm interested in the fact that it is the poché space.
Okay.
And Vitcover leaves that out.
Just to follow up on that, I mean, another thing that Vitcover leaves out is orientation.
Yeah.
And my main question would be, given that there's such off the first presentation, there's such a dependence on military forms, and there's such a dependence in military forms on handedness, in Greek military and Roman military. Is there, or do you see a handedness within these projects of any
You're referring to Caricati? You're
Well, I
referring
mean,
to?
it's just more of a general question because of the military, the introduction, we came into the military because of the role that handedness plays in the military formations that were displayed. Even in the chiaroscuro, looking at the way that the drawings are rendered, they're always rendered to a right-handed, there's always light coming in from the right-handed side if you were within the drawing looking out. But I don't know if that relates, this is relatively new to me, and I'm trying to figure out how the formal composition of the buildings, if that has a handedness, the way that the illustrations do, and the way that the military formations that we the dynamism do.
But one thing to say about the Kirikati site is that it was completely different in the 16th century because it's really an open space because that was the edge of the city. In front of Palazzo Caricati was completely empty because it was the harbor of the for boat, and so was really in a very unusual position because it's at the edge of the city, not inside the city, completely empty in front of him, and from the loggias of upstairs you can see all the countryside, and so is really a strange object because it's not a palace because you can see from afar. You are not compressed like Palazzo or other the palace, and you can see from the palace very far. And also this is completely unusual in Palladio building. And so, excuse me.
Go ahead.
No, it's finished.
I wanted to say that one of the things that Vitkover leaves out, which I think is extraordinary, is that what we would call the Barchesa, the outbuildings, which Palladio included in his drawings in most of his projects. And the outbuildings are really what tie these structures to the land. And so you can say, well, not only is there no orientation, but there's no tie to the site. And not to have the Barchesa and to have students think this is the way these things were are really false. I mean, I think it was a real mutation that Vitkover did for his own purposes. Whereas to me, one of the important issues is the Barchesa and how they relate and how they related to the whole project of entry and organization of land.
Absolutely true.
Yeah.
The Barchesa is the project of Palladio is to connect the house with the Barchesa.
Yes.
This is the new, because also before Palladio you can find farm in the countryside with a threshing floor, with a colombara, with a barn, but Palladio bring together and create an architecture. And this is true, I think. This is the problem of Vitkover.
Oh, it's one of the I think the
No,
Poche too. is,
Any final questions? Oh, yes, okay.
Hello.
Yeah.
I was wondering, in the course of looking at the three presentations, I couldn't
Sorry,
help. In the course of looking at the three presentations,
Yeah.
I couldn't help but perceive a sort of first a transition and then a distinction between the operation of, let's say, moving from solid to void. That is to say, I was struck in particular from the opening sequence when we saw Spartacus, and we saw the distinction in terms of cinematography of looking frontally, or almost from bird's eye view, as you say, looking at the marching of Roman columns, always from a distance, so that we really perceive the greater aggregated geometries as opposed to the close-up of letters. So the distinction, let's say, between the lambda, which comprises in the phalanxes diagrams, the single soldier, as opposed to the greater aggregate of the soldiers, so that we comprise a greater, larger geometry. I was wondering in that case, because I couldn't help but sort of perceive a distinction in terms of the presentation, where in the first one we saw something that was much more analysis in plan, which transitions later in much more analysis in elevation, and then later into analysis in axonometry. In a sense, at the same time, I saw also a distinction moving from the operation of, let's say, if we wanted to bring back the theme of this conference, let's just say the genome, moving from combination to recombination, such that we have a piece of lambda, which originally starts out in plan as an anonymous piece of brick, let's say, the same way that we have the lambda associated with a particular person, but was, operationally entirely indistinct and indifferent, such that they only comprise more pieces of larger geometry. and then transitioning from this stone, let's say the solid material, into the elevation, the carving architecture material, and then later in axonometric into the void, the spaces, so that there's a distinction between the void and solid operation, even though at the same time, the capacity of operating on this sort of solid and void mass, this lambda, is contained throughout. So I was wondering if we could sort of address this notion that I just couldn't help but perceive in the course of looking at your continuous, rather perhaps intentional presentations.
I'm going to try to summarize that. What I understand, Michael, your question was the different relations of solid and void when you start from the plan, let's say plan and bird's eye view in Guido's presentation, the not exclusively facade, but more just following your lines, vertical facade orientation in mine, and then Peter's axonometric. Is that accurate? What you were?
But I suppose it's also a matter of the fact that we're talking about reformations and a central analogy with genome and basis. In this case, it's a shift of the genome from the base from the solid, let's say, gathered stones, the highlights, the columns, and then in elevation pieces of stone that needs to be replicated, and also constructing a building such as there is up to when we look at Peripati, what seems to be a synthesis of that, that's to say the operations are now engaged in void space as opposed to actual sort of rock-like material. And degree, perhaps, simply in that case, degree, it's possible to see the double columns as artifact of the operation, which would otherwise not be visible. People were saying before that in place of some footings of the object. In this case, as you transition from the solid to void, it's literally not just metaphorical, but not just in terms of analysis, but such that the approach has to be maintained by
these two gentlemen are asking me to summarize here.
No, him. What he said
No, I
again.
know. Let me ask this, Michael, because it's getting a little bit late. We've got a couple more questions over here, which we'll do quickly. That could stand as a statement, more than a question. I mean, a form of analysis that tried to link the three papers, which I makes, is food for thought for all of us about those relations that you mentioned over here. But do you have do you want to like pitch it at somebody over here? No.
No, don't do that.
would be possible. If we look at how you analyze the basic material, in looking at that, there's a notion that as Palladio was drawing these portions, moving the stairs back and forth, moving walls back and forth, as you're looking at the connection between that and looking at arm positions, there's a symmetry in terms of
Tell me yes.
as opposed to looking at the pieces of elevation which are moved around, work, scale, proportion, and so forth. And then having the A, B, and C spaces, the approaches are the same, it's just that there's a tremendously
No.
I'm getting nervousness on the side over here because this basketball player over here is. I think
President's watching.
I think that's a really crucial question, but I think that after a few more we should take that up. It's a long answer, I think. It would be a different answer for each of us. But I think it's a very interesting question about how you perceive the unit, and from where and how it would reposition, to use that in relation to these questions of void and shift as you're bringing up. I think that's a crucial question for all of us, for sure. I'm just going to take a couple more
Freddie.
questions. No, we got. I'm seeing
Freddie.
this over here. So Frederick, yeah.
It's a question for Guido. You mentioned that you were looking for this virtual villa inside the Palladio's work, and I think we know your desire for looking for kind of pleasure of the mind that is built within the built environment. Do you think that Palladio, through his strategy of compression and inscription of maybe those military movement or those forms that were frozen in stone but existed in multiple possible reading on multiple level, was also trying to create such a virtual reading or mental reading of the space?
All right, I never try and second guess an architect. I don't know what Corbu was up to, or Mies, or, or Tarani. I mean, I don't try and do that. I just say, I look at the stuff and I say, hey, here's what I do. I mean, Jacques Derrida, when I worked with him, used to say, hey, you don't need me because you misread everything. And I do. And so misreading is what deconstruction is all about. So it doesn't matter to me whether Palladio was after that or not, for me.
I'm sorry. Ask us on the way out over here. I'm getting a very firm head shake from Benjamin, who has to get us off to the restaurant, and so I want to thank Benjamin. I also want to thank a couple people in the audience over here who helped produce some of the remarkable drawings over here in my presentation. Luke Wilson, Michael Young, Benjamin Holberg, and Kyung-jae Kim over here. And I'd like to thank these two gentlemen over here, Guido and Peter. And I'd like to thank Charles Hines and Irina Murray of the RIBA for holding on to these precious documents for us.
Letting us see them.
Yeah.